Today we'll use Unit 46 and 47 of your grammar book to talk about relative clauses. Let's start. Relative clauses are a way to extend our sentences by adding information. These clauses have to relate to something or someone in the original sentence. The word relative should remind you of human relatives like your family and your aunts and uncles. And just like how we are closer to relatives than any outsiders, the relative clauses always stay together with the words that they refer to. The relative pronoun always comes immediately after the person or thing that it refers to. And remember, there is never a subject pronoun after the relative pronoun, because the relative pronoun has replaced the original pronoun. We'll now talk about subject and object, but we're referring only to the structure within the relative clause. Subject means, within the relative clause, the relative pronoun is taking an active form, such as who wrote and who argued. Object would mean the relative pronoun takes the passive form within the relative clause. For example, which was written, who was argued. Before we move on, let me remind you, the relative pronoun and the relative clause that it leads always comes immediately after whoever or whatever it refers to. Now for relative pronouns, we use who for people. So in this picture, Luffy is a person, so we would use the pronoun who. For things, we would use the pronoun which. In this picture, we would use which for the plate and the animal, Chopper. This brings us to the case of animals. When we refer to animals in general, we usually use the pronoun it. So we can use the relative pronoun which. However, when we know the gender of the animal, say if your pet is male, you would use the pronoun he. In this case, you may use who to refer to animals. Or in the case of our picture, Chopper is a character who has a clear identity, almost like a person. So we would use who for him as well. The pronouns we use for animals do change depending on the context and the meaning that we want to make. Finally, if we want to mention some things that belong to someone, we would use the relative pronoun whose. Like in our picture, Chopper and Luffy are eating the food. So I may describe the scenario as, I saw the pirates whose food smelled really nice. These two examples show the relative pronoun as an object. As you can see, the relative pronoun which is taking the passive form within the relative clause, which were used and which were described. But it doesn't matter if the relative pronoun is the object or subject, it should still come immediately after the person or thing that it is referring to. When we have an object clause, which means we are using the passive voice within the relative clause, we can leave out the relative pronoun, as it is shown in these two examples. The pronouns that we can use in an object clause is basically the same as the ones for a subject clause. For people, when you try to be formal, you may use whom. We'll explore the use of whom a little bit more in the next unit. For things and animals, we still use which. Please correct the notes on your page and change the word people to things. Something new is, if you want to mention one thing belonging to another thing, we can't use whose because we are not referring to a person. In this case, we may use of which. Now that you understand how we use relative clauses to extend sentences and the relative pronouns that we use, we can move on to the two big types of relative clauses, defining and non-defining relative clauses. Defining clauses, as you can tell from the name, relates to definition. So defining clauses gives important information that defines the thing or person that they refer to. As for non-defining ones, they simply give you extra information. In terms of structure, since defining clauses give important information, there are no commas before and after the clause to show that this important information is an integrated part of the sentence. On the other hand, non-defining clauses are only giving extra information. Therefore, we would use commas before and after the clause to show that this information is extra and therefore not an integrated part of the sentence. Now you may be wondering when you should use a defining relative clause and when to use a non-defining relative clause. To make the decision, simply ask yourself one question. Is your sentence clear enough? In other words, do you need to define anything in your sentence to help people understand what you're saying? Take a look at these two sets of examples. The first three sentences all have defining relative clauses. If you pay attention to the person or thing that is being defined, you would notice one shared quality, that is, they all begin with the. We know that the article the in English is used to refer to something specific. So when you're trying to give me information about something or someone that is specific, you have to define for me who or what you are talking about. When you say the woman, you have to tell me which particular woman you are talking about. In this case, it is not just any woman, it is the woman who visited me in the hospital. As you can see, when you need to define something in your sentence to make the meaning clear, you need to use a defining relative clause. You need the relative clause to explain, or your sentence will be hard to understand. Now let's look at the last three sentences. These three are all using the non-defining relative clauses. And if you look at the people or things that are being referred to, they all seem different, but they all share one quality, that is, they are clear enough on their own without any further definition. When you say elephants, I simply mean elephants in general. There's no need to define anything. If I mention John's mother, he only has one mother, then there's no need to define. Or the simplest case is when you have a name. Whenever you mention a name, we assume that the identity is clear enough and there's no need to define any more. So the difference between these two types is just whether you need to make things clearer. There is still one factor that can affect your decision, that is context. In this sentence, we understand the need to use a defining relative clause because when I have 4 envelopes all in different colors, I need to be very clear which is the letter that I receive. However, consider this. In this second example, we are still referring to the letter, but with other information, perhaps in a paragraph, or you are really in the situation that you know that is the only letter there. There is no need to define anymore, so you can use a non-defining relative clause. So when you're choosing between these two types of relative clauses, the rules about having the article the or using names and general things only apply when you are writing one sentence, like in our grammar exercises or sometimes exam questions. But if you have a whole paragraph that you are writing yourself or you're filling in the blanks for, then you will have to consider the context as well. If you have prepositions in your object clauses, you may still refer it to people or things. The technicality here is just how formal you have to be. When you're trying to be formal, put the preposition first and the pronoun after. For example, to whom, in which, from which, on whose, and so on. If you don't have to be formal, then the usual way to use it in daily life is simply put the preposition at the end of the sentence, such as who you want to forward the message to, or which we measure air pressure with. Here are some other relative pronouns you can use to refer to reason, time, and place. And aside from referring to someone or something in the sentence, we can also refer to a part of the sentence. Simply use which. But in this case, you still have to put the relative pronoun which immediately after the part of the sentence that you wish to refer to. And there must be a comma before which.